Great. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak today. The title of my talk today is "The Time Is Now." Basically, I'm going to be talking about regulatory changes that are happening in the United States right now, which affect people who are building protocols, people who believe in decentralization, people who are building things in DeFi. Before I start the presentation, though, I do want to give a little bit of context about what is happening right now and kind of the general history of organizations, specifically limited liability, joint stock corporations, and how that relates to DAOs. There's a common misconception that the corporation was kind of an inevitable result of market forces that led people to pool their capital for joint ventures at a large scale. People kind of assume that this was kind of fated to happen because of the nature of the market. But this is actually not true. And this understanding is really important to be able to frame what is happening with crypto today, with our ideals and values in crypto today, what is happening with decentralization, what is happening with DeFi, what is happening with the US government, and what we see happening around the world. Originally, joint stock corporations were a creation of political necessity. Joint stock corporations were actually the creation of the state. There was a period of time in which people did not actually think organizations should last longer than the human body would last. Their idea was that the only thing eternal was the state, and the state alone. Before the joint stock corporation, actually people believed that joint stock corporations were a bad idea. And this might seem strange, but people thought, there's this idea that if you didn't have direct responsibility, you wouldn't do a good job at operating. So before the joint stock corporation, everyone had unlimited liability for everything that they worked on. If you started a business with someone and you went out of business or you had some debts, you were liable for absolutely everything you had. They used to say up to your cufflinks. And this parallels the situation that DeFi and DAOs have been in for the past few years, right? You have a token, you are in a DAO. Well, surprise, surprise, you have unlimited, unseverable liability up to your cufflinks for anything that any other token holder in this organization did. And of course, we always talked about how crazy that sounded and how dumb that was and how it made no sense. But this was actually the natural state of the world for a long, long time, and people believed in it. The leading economists in the 16th and 17th centuries, they believed that you required this kind of unlimited liability for the correct and profitable operation of organizations. If you did not have this unlimited liability, you would somehow be lazy. In fact, when first joint stock corporations started to appear, prominent economic thinkers thought this idea of if everyone had ownership, there would be actually no operation, right? So what changed primarily is that the state needed to finance new kinds of operations that were beyond their own control, and they had a specific kind of fear of the organizations that did exist in the time that could pool capital, namely things like monasteries. One of the ways that the state used to, tax the people was they would tax your property when it passed from, a descendant to someone else. Like you died and you transfer your property, there would be a tax. But if you gave it to the monastery, well, then the church could just hold on to it forever. The monastery could hold on to it forever. So what happened was, primarily there were a number of large things that happened in colonialism that required a lot more capital than you could get from a single rich family or a couple of rich people who pooled their money together, right? These were very risky things, voyages to the other side of the world, right? These kinds of things people wouldn't put their money up for because if something happened, they would lose everything they had, right? It wouldn't matter if you were the smallest shareholder in some sort of operation, you were liable 100% for everything. So the state created political organizations called joint stock corporations where you would actually get this limited liability, this idea that you would be liable only up to the amount of tokens that you held, right? And no more. And this allowed people to pool capital in greater numbers. But it was not something that the market liked. The market thought that this was a way for people to be lazy, to not participate, to reap these benefits, And if you look at actually what the situation has been with DAOs in the past couple of years, in many ways you'd argue that they were right. Vast number of token holders don't do shit. They don't do anything in these organizations, right? And this was actually a great fear in the Middle Ages and later around economic thinkers. So the joint stock corporation and this limited liability and this recognition of the corporation is a political creation. Not only is it a political creation, but it continues to be, in many ways, a political creation. This idea of personhood for the corporation is a legal fiction that changes quite often. And in fact, many of the largest corporations today remain weird public-private hybrids. If you think it's something like Elon Musk and his company and how many subsidies he directly receives from the government, when you look at any of these large corporations, most of them exist thanks to some form of state sponsorship. The corporation remains today a political entity more than it actually is an economic one. So, jumping into the presentation, the time is now. What we see happening is that this same change that occurred around the time of colonialism and the explosion of railroads is happening again with DAOs and decentralization. The state sees a new threat to its power structure, where the definition of organizations comes from software, from code. Just as monasteries were able to suck tax dollars and suck revenue out from the state, protocols are now able to take value away from the state in a different way. It is both a threat, but an opportunity. The opportunity, though, is not a natural market opportunity. And in many ways, if you think about it, especially in the past few years, the amount of sort of like hate and vitriol that crypto community has sort of gotten from the larger world out there, you would agree, right? The state now sees value in what we're building, although many ordinary people generally haven't as of yet. So, what I'm going to talk about is these regulatory updates. My name is Dennison Bertram. I am CEO and co-founder of Tally. We are the sort of basically leader in building tooling for decentralization in the ecosystem. We've been doing this for the past 5 years. Big disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. None of this is legal advice. I have to get that out there, very important. So what's happening right now, based on sort of like what I was just mentioning, is that we're getting this regulatory clarity. The state is defining decentralization the same way it defined limited liability, it defined the corporation. It is not a market factor that's happening, it's a political arrangement that's happening. We see new legal entities, the DUNA in Wyoming, and on-chain committees such as Borgs being created. The SEC, Congress, top DAOs, everyone is starting to work together and say, hey, we need to go colonize India. We need more money. We need to build railroads. We need more money, right? Organizations today are starting to work with the government to say, hey, we need limited liability so we can do bigger things. We need proper decentralization so that we don't have to, rely on centralized control elements. The SEC DeFi Roundtable, this was maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago, you can see what the commissioners were saying, which really speaks to the regulatory shift, the tone of shift that's happening in Washington, right? Pierce has said that publishing code is not the same thing as offering securities, right? That creating software is free speech. Atkins, validators aren't broker-dealers. Uyeda, collaboration is more important right now than enforcement. And Crenshaw, better to do it right than fast, which maybe isn't as productive as we want. I'm sure everyone here wants it fast more than anything else, right? But this is a very clear regulatory tone shift. We've been working through the market structure bill. This is a draft, it's not law yet, but we've been working through this, and the most recent version of this is the Clarity Act, which has passed some parts of the government, but essentially defines digital commodities and DAO-related exemptions from securities laws. Right? We are creating a new political entity, the decentralized organization. And what is going to define decentralized organizations is a rules-based system based on what is control, who operates these organizations, right? Genius Act is another piece of regulatory update here, which is very interesting. Stablecoins, right? Establishing payment stablecoins as a distinct regulatory category. This, again, is a very interesting idea, right? This is clearly political, right? Obviously, Circle exists. They've IPO'd. We've got stablecoins. Tether's been out there, whether or not New York State has liked it, right? But in effect, with the government saying, hey, we are going to create a special category for stablecoins, it's a political arrangement, right? The United States and many other governments are saying, okay, our currencies, they compete on this global market. We need regulations around it so that we can win. This is very important for people who build DAOs and decentralized organizations because it gives a clear regulatory path for stablecoin use, right? That's very important. If these organizations have money, and they have a lot of money, and they spend money, they need more regulations around what kind of money they can use. Very important, staking. Staking is a very new idea in the grand scheme of things, right? It has existed in a little bit of a regulatory gray zone. So what's going to happen now, right? The SEC has acknowledged that validator operation is not financial intermediation. Probably remember in the past few years, we've been very concerned. If I run a wallet service, am I X? If I do staking, am I Y? Right? This seeks to clarify this. Protocol staking and node operations are exempt from securities classification. There's a distinction made between passive token staking, protocol level, and active pooled financial products. And this also circles around the idea of control. And in general, this signals a growing acceptance of staking as a core infrastructure, not an investment contract, right? Again, this is very important. This is very political. This is an interesting one. A16Z, Miles Jennings, he recently put out an article called The End of the Foundation Era. It's a really good read, but it talks to how many of the legal structures that we've had set up in the past 4+ years were actually defined by the regulatory murkiness that we had. We built kinds of foundations to separate responsibility, to intermediate token holders and founders. But what Miles Jennings is saying is actually in this new paradigm, we are not going to need foundations. We are going to have the kind of regulatory clarity that allows founders to build and launch tokens and operate together. And if the Clarity Act passes fully in its current embodiment, we will also have a clear roadmap to when something gets decentralized and what the definition of centralization is. So in this article, I highly recommend it. He talks about how these foundations were structured. There has been a lot of pushback on this as well. Depends on if you are a big foundation fan, if you understand very well what foundations are used for and how people use them. There are other great reasons why people use foundations. Caymans, for one, has substantial tax benefits. It's really unclear how we onshore existing foundations to the United States. It is a bit clearer now how we're probably going to be able to build up foundations in the United States. Things are going to be able to be, for example, like a benefit corporation. You'll be able to use a DUNA. You'll be able to use things like Borgs to wrap specific parts of protocols where you have this legal fallback for on-chain operations. And this is all very interesting because we started this whole movement with this idea of code is law. And of course, the government says, well, no, law is law. And what's happening now is kind of the merging of these two things. So the DUNA, if you haven't heard about it, it's a Wyoming law. It basically gives legal personhood to decentralized organizations. That's very exciting, and that is on the order of the original idea of legal personhood for corporations. Now you can have legal personhood for this association of token holders operating a protocol. You don't have to have a board, no shareholders, but it can sign contracts, open bank accounts, file taxes. The government, of course, is very, very concerned about that third thing there, filing taxes. It gives us limited liability. And many organizations are considering this. I think Nouns is already a DUNA. Uniswap is considering the DUNA. Many other organizations, especially in the United States, are considering the DUNA for at least some part of their project or protocol. Borgs, this is an idea that comes from Gabe Shapiro. basically this idea of a legal on-chain wrapper. It's smart contract governance with enforceable bylaws in the legal side. ZK Sync is an example here of using it. They use it to wrap their guardian councils and security councils. So ZK Sync, they wrap their security council, their guardian council, using Borgs. So there is an on-chain component that specifically says what people can do on-chain, and then there's a legal part around it that covers if someone doesn't behave as they're expected to. Uniswap, right? The Foundation Feedback Group recently made a post. They support the DUNA transition for Uniswap. Uniswap is actually a foundation out of the United States. They're based out of New York, and they're thinking about launching a DUNA. And that'll hopefully happen in the near future, or at least that'll go up for vote in the near future. But the big goal here is to reduce friction, expand capabilities, things like signing documents, and protecting token holders. Because protecting token holders, there's something very important to note here. Token holders are liable for two things. One, the government can go after you, although now that concern has been somewhat lifted. But private plaintiffs can go after you, which is the real important part that DUNA is trying to solve here. You need to give this limited liability so someone can't just buy a uni token, have it go down in price, and then sue everyone in the DAO for having lost money. So what should builders be doing next? Well, if you're building, because I'm running out of time, so I'll go a little bit fast here, evaluate things like DUNAs, evaluate things like Borgs. You can definitely come and talk to us at Tally. We do a lot of this. This is what we live and breathe. Engage with the regulators if that's something you feel comfortable doing. Why it matters, going back to sort of like what I started with, the modern world is shaped based on this political arrangement that emerged out of primarily Europe, but it happened in other places as well, of giving limited liability. This modern world is transitioning right now to a world that's going to be powered by decentralized organizations. And it again is going to be a political moment that is going to enable the growth of so many things. A great example is Wall Street in the early days of Wall Street existed mainly only to trade railroad stocks. And I like mentioning that because when you look at crypto, the crypto markets today traditionally exist kind of in many ways only to trade things like meme coins or DeFi protocol stocks, right? But of course today the stock market trades everything. And I think we should think about what the future of crypto looks like, where today we may use it to only do a small number of things, but actually the innovation here will eventually allow us to do everything. Final thought. We might really actually do it this time, right? If we get the Clarity Act, if we get the Genius Bill, if we get these things, at least in the United States, we will have a workable regulatory framework for decentralized organizations. And if you look at the history of the Joint Stock Corporation, once they existed, every other jurisdiction rushed to implement a version of it because it was so highly competitive. We should expect to see this kind of growth if we get this legislation, right? So that's very important. It's important also for us as builders, us as founders, to sort of start orienting our projects, what we build, our protocols, our vision, towards a future that is vastly larger than we're probably even thinking today. So here's some resources we're just launching today, cryptoclarity.us. Basically a chatbot that'll talk to you about all new things in the regulatory space. It's updated regularly so you can understand how the SEC is thinking about it, how the CFTC is thinking about it. Lots of great sources there. You could always ask us a question at tally.xyz. We're experts in this. We help many projects. So if you're looking to decentralize, be compliant, come speak with us. Yeah, there's a QR code if you want to learn more. But yeah, the time for this is now, and I, for one, am super excited for it.
Thank you, Dennison. We have a few moments, or a few minutes for questions here. We have a question up there. Oh, the microphone's coming for you.
I think one of the challenges that a lot of dApps face is like the regional or localization problem for jurisdictions. So I think one of the benefits, obviously, of an offshore foundation is that you live nowhere. But when you start to situate your compliance in one jurisdiction versus another, you have the same dApp with different rules depending on where the users are accessing it from. Wondering if you think about how these applications should approach that.
Yeah, so there's kind of two pieces to that. The French actually had a form of the joint stock corporation that was a little bit more liberal before the British. And the British were very nervous about expanding the idea, because originally corporations they were chartered, and they allowed you to do things like have an army, for example, as your corporation. But America and France and some other places, specifically France, they liberalized their rules. And what happened in the UK was UK corporations incorporated in France and then did business in the UK. And that was a big reason why the UK ended up liberalizing its rules, because of this regulatory competition. I would expect us to see that as well. What I think is going to happen most likely right now for people who are building and sort of deciding this where they're going to be domiciled, they'll probably be domiciled in the United States, and the United States will probably become the sort of gold standard for what the rules look like. And most likely in other regions where they're trying to be competitive, they'll probably try and do something even more liberal than that. We do, however, exist right now in a little bit of a wait and see to figure out how these things are going to work. But even within the United States, you'll have a thing where individual states have their own sort of applications and laws. So, for example, I'm based in New York, and most of the cool new crypto stuff like debit cards and stuff like that we can't use there. So we'll probably still see a lot of hodgepodge of sort of application, but with this clarity coming, we'll probably see that open up and become more uniform very quickly.
Another question for Dennison down here.
Hello. So I think a big problem in adoption by now has been that we speak in echo chambers. The government on their side, the private sector, the companies on their side. Do you get involved in this process of building legal frameworks like the one in US? Yes, no? And how do we make our voices heard more? The governments to take more into account the technical part, the needs for developing this industry, while of course protecting the customer and still encourage the development and evolution of the industry.
Yeah, so the echo chamber thing is real, but it's probably a little bit less of an impact today than it's historically been. If you follow the echo chamber on Twitter these days, most of crypto is in DC now. So I think a lot of crypto organizations do have kind of a direct line with the government. We're in a very bizarre place where now, I think, maybe people in DC have more exposure to crypto than maybe people in this room, which is pretty wild. You can definitely write the SEC. You can definitely reach out to your local organizations or local regulatory jurisdictions to leave a comment. I think at this point that concern is that would have been a greater concern to me a year ago than it is today. Today, there are a lot of people who are, you look at A16Z, you look at Cooley, you look at, many of the great lawyers in the space. They are present in DC. If you look at, there's originally for this presentation, I had a image of Stani at the Capitol building. He was there, last week speaking with regulators and legislators. So I think actually finally we have that platform in the government. Again, this is going to be a legal construction. Decentralization is going to become a legal construction in many ways. And there's a lot of advantages for the government in that. So I think, the same way that most economists and business people didn't want joint stock corporations, but the state needed it, we're actually at an inflection point where that's happening with crypto as well.
Please give it up for Dennison. Thank you so much, Dennison.